World history. Did you miss me? I missed you. Yesterday, we talked about World War II and we talked about the United States' role in World War II and then the terms of the Treaty of Versailles and how they set the stage for World War II. And we also mentioned a revolution in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution. Another thing we talked about was propaganda. And that's a great segue into today's lesson because here uh, you have an excellent example of American anti-communist propaganda. First of all, as a newly mustachioed gentleman, I can tell you that this is weak sauce, but that's okay. The top line said, "As your washroom breeding Bolsheviks, um, employees lose respect for a company that fails to provide decent facilities for their comfort." So basically, this is a commercial for washcloths, but they're comparing Bolsheviks to germs, to bacteria. The Russian Revolution was like a firecracker with a very long fuse. The explosion came in 1917, but the fuse had been burning for almost 100 years. Most of the czars in Russia up to that point had been very strict, had not given a lot of rights to the Russian citizens. And there really was not peace within Russia in terms of just social unrest. Had been there, had been a presence for decades. In 1825, kind of fed up with that, some army officers revolt, and we start seeing these secret revolutionary groups plotting to overthrow the government. You guys remember talking about revolutions when we talked about the American Revolution, essentially trying to overthrow one government, your current government, and establish another one. 1881. Alex II is assassinated because he's not helping the poor. Um, in 1881, revolutionaries that were mad about the hesitance of Alex to um, get more progressive to help his people more. He was overthrown, assassinated. Excuse me. And when Alex was assassinated, that's said to have really sort of pushed the ball of revolution down the hill. It got it started before eventually it was inevitable. The czars didn't want change, and you can understand why. If you're a czar, you have more or less absolute power, or at least you're incredibly powerful. So you can see how peasants who were struggling and who weren't receiving the help they needed certainly wanted to change. Army officers who had lost faith in the czar, they would absolutely want to change as well. But if you're a czar, there's nothing better, basically, than protecting the status quo. So they didn't want to. Alex III says, "You know what? My father was trying to implement reforms and he wasn't doing it fast enough for you. So he just ends it. He says, we're not going to provide those. We're not going to head towards those reforms anymore." And once Alex III is in power, he's going to put in what we call autocratic rule. You guys have heard that phrase at this point, but Autocratic just basically means nobody can speak out against it. No one can oppose it at all, at least not publicly. So, an incredibly strict, oppressive style of governance. Another element of this, see up top, it says government censors written criticism, secret police monitor school. But down at the bottom, it says non Russians living in Russia are treated harshly. Unfortunately, this is a theme that comes up time and time again. When a country is really struggling, when they're just really in the pits, there's a tendency to look for a scapegoat, to look for someone to blame. And a lot of times, and this includes in the United States during World War II, but a lot of times the people of the country either intentionally or subconsciously point their anger and their resentment at quote unquote foreigners living among them. So it became very difficult to not be a Russian living in Russia. There just was no room under Alex III for anything other than complete loyalty to the crown. And Jews make an easy target for Alex II or for Hitler, of course. They became the target of government backed programs. Excuse me, it's pogroms. um, Alex basically wants to banish Jewish people. So he says, America says that they're the land of opportunity. Uh, you need to go over there. And we do see a significant increase in the Jewish community in America during this time. Also, truth be told, I've never seen it, but my grandmother loved it. There's a very famous musical. It's been around, well, since this era was, excuse me, it's not since that era, but set in that era. Uh, I might watch that tonight. Nicholas II became czar after Alex III, and he doesn't change the status quo. He continues to rule like Alex had. If you recall from talking about World War One, at that point Russia had not industrialized to the extent of Western European countries. A lot of Western European countries, France, Spain, England, and then over here in the United States. So they had a strong military because, in part, they had such a huge population, but in terms of developing industry, these factories, ability to produce things efficiently and effectively, they were lagging behind. But a positive of this era for Russia is that they really do expand their industrial sector very rapidly. They start building up factories and creating factory jobs and producing things, and they're able to double it in just 30. What is that? 36 years. But even in doubling it, they were still behind the other countries that they wanted to be peers with. And they also start building infrastructure. Remember, the United States did this. You create during the New Deal. So I guess you guys will study that when you're seniors. But um, when a country is really in the dumps, they would create infrastructure projects like building railroads and dams and bridges, because not only is that improving the country, the facilities that we have to use, but it's putting people to work as well. Wages and conditions were just about the only change. They got a little bit better because the revolutionary movement goes beyond the government. So these workers, they're fighting for better wages and conditions. And this guy named Karl Marx, um, he had this basically vision for the communist future, for the Marxist future, that said that eventually the proletariat, which is the term used to describe basically the working class, was going to take over and they would rule. Recognize that guy? Lenin was a Bolshevik leader, and he's one of the most iconic figures in Russia. Lenin did a really good job of appealing to Russian pride, and he was able to take power, and was really just highly exalted. Russia had their own skirmishes and full-on wars before World War One. That was not their first foray into uh, warring. They were defeated by Russia, or excuse me, by Japan in the Russo-Japanese War, and that just really upset the Russian people. They were embarrassed to lose, let alone to the Japanese, who Russia would have certainly found to be an inferior people. So society was angry, and they wanted a change. They basically wanted to redeem themselves on the global stage. And people come to protest. They come to protest, and the Tsar sends his soldiers out, and they attack the protesters. So the Tsar, at this point, remember, he was um, a full on dictator. He didn't allow any speaking out against the political leadership. And at this point, things are so bad, things are so bitter between the people and the Tsar that he actually sent his army out and killed a bunch of people, a bunch of Russians. They call that Bloody Sunday. At that point, um, that was just like such a bad look for. Hang on a second, guys. All right, sorry about that, guys. So yeah, but my point is, Bloody Sunday was so bad that even Nicholas was like, "All right, I gotta do something, because if I don't, this is gonna wind up being a full on revolution." Part of the uh, concessions, or the things, the reforms that Nicholas was willing to put in, was giving more responsibility to something called the Duma. The, the Duma was basically Russia's first parliament, so it was a lawmaking body. or it was supposed to. But the czar lets them meet for like 10 weeks and says, like, you know what? I don't like this. I don't like having to share power with this parliament. And he gets rid of the agency. We already talked about their role in World War One. So we won't go too much further into that. This guy is, without a doubt, top five most bizarre characters that I've studied in history. Certainly top 10. His name is Rasputin. There's a disco song called Rasputin, but I'm not going to make us listen to that because although some disco is pretty solid, this one is not one of those examples. So Rasputin, and I found an article from the Smithsonian Museum about him that I'm going to read here in a second. But Tsarina, the Tsar's wife, falls under the influence of Rasputin. He was this like wizardy sort of spiritual guru, referred to himself and was referred to as a holy man. She felt like she had she felt like Rasputin had the power to um, heal her son. Her son was very sick, and Rasputin sold himself as being basically a faith healer. But the nobles do not like this huge influence that Rasputin has, so he's eventually murdered. And even the story of his murder is super bizarre. So we're going to pause with the PowerPoint. We're going to come up here to the murder of Rasputin 100 years later. All right. The murder of Rasputin 100 years later. How does the killing of the so called Mad Monk fit into the larger picture of the Russian Revolution? First of all, he looks like a mad monk. That's undeniable. The holy man is he who takes your soul and makes them his. When you choose your holy man, you surrender your will. You give it to him in utter submission, in full renunciation. Fedor Dostoevsky, whatever, guys. I can't speak Russian. The murder of Rasputin, Russia's infamous mad monk, is the fodder for a great historical tale that bends fact and legend. But the depth of the controversial holy man and faith healer has a combustible effect on the tense state of affairs in pre revolution Russia. Rasputin was killed on December 30th, 1916, December 17th in the Russian calendar in use at the time. In the basement of the Moika Palace, the St. Petersburg residence of Prince Felix Yusupov, the richest man in Russia and the husband of the Tsar's only niece, Irina, his battered body was discovered in the Neva River a few days later. I wonder if you guys can hear the garbage truck, whatever that is, going behind me. In the decade prior, Rasputin had risen rapidly through Russian society, starting as an obscure Siberian peasant turned wandering holy man, and then becoming one of the most prominent figures in the Tsar's inner circle. Born in 1869 in the village of Pog on the Tura River that flows eastward from the Ural Mountains where Europe meets Asia and Siberia. He seemed destined for an ordinary life, despite a few conflicts in his youth with local authorities for unruly behavior. He married a local woman, Pras Dubrovina, became the father of three surviving children, Maria, Dmitri, and Varvara, and worked on his family's farm. Rasputin's life changed in 1892 when he spent months at a monastery, putting him on the path to international renown. Despite his later nickname, the Mad Monk, Rasputin never took holy orders. Men in Rasputin's position usually gave up their past lives and relationships, but Rasputin continued to see his family. His daughters later lived with him in St. Petersburg and support his wife financially. His religious fervor, combined with an appealing personal charisma, brought Rasputin to the attention of some Russian Orthodox clergymen and then senior members of the imperial family, who then introduced him to Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra. Nicholas wrote to one of his ministers in October 1906, "A few days ago I received a peasant from the Tobolsk district, Grigory Rasputin, who brought me an icon of Saint Simon. He made a remarkably strong impression both on Her Majesty and on myself, so that instead of 5 minutes, our conversation went on for more than an hour." The imperial couple had consulted unconventional spiritual advisors in the past, but Rasputin filled this role by his ability to read their inner hopes and tell them what they wanted to hear. He encouraged Nicholas to have more confidence in his role as Tsar, and Alexandra found that his counsel soothed her anxieties. By the First World War, Rasputin was also providing political advice and making recommendations for ministerial appointments, much to the dismay of the Russian elite. Rasputin cemented his relationship with the Tsar and Tsarina when he supposedly helped alleviate their only son, Alexei's hemophilia. Rasputin's alleged healing powers continue to be debated today. The Tsar's sister, Grand Duchess Olga, wrote that she observed Rasputin healing Alexei by kneeling at the foot of his bed and praying. The calming atmosphere that he created in the palace may have assisted with the recovery. Alexandra's lady in waiting, Baroness Sophie, thought that Rasputin employed peasant folk medicine used in Siberian villages to treat internal bleeding in horses. Historians continue to debate Rasputin's impact on Alexei's health. In his 2016 book, Rasputin, Fate, Power, and the Twilight of the Romanovs, Douglas Smith observes, Rasputin's assurances calmed the anxious, fretful mother and filled her with unshakable confidence, and she, in turn, transferred this confidence to her ailing son, literally willing him back to health. In addition to increasing confidence and recovery, a key variable may have been Rasputin's insistence that doctors keep away from Alexei. Medical knowledge was still sparse, even though drugs like aspirin were available for treatment. Unfortunately for Alexei, aspirin, considered a cure-all remedy, had the then unknown side effect of thinning the blood, which would have exacerbated hemophilia symptoms. French historian Hélène argued that when Rasputin insisted that remedies prescribed by the doctors be thrown in the fire, the discarded medicine likely would have included aspirin. Rasputin's insistence that the doctors leave him alone would have improved his condition and appeared to create a miraculous improvement in his symptoms. Here's the thing about Rasputin. He was also very powerful with the ladies. And I'm not sure that these are necessarily ladies one would want to associate with. This one has a pretty hardy mustache, but nonetheless, he was, I mean, an absolute legend and definitely not joking. Rasputin presented himself in the imperial court as a holy man despite no formal affiliation with the Russian Orthodox Church, and spoke as a self appointed representative of the peasantry. But his behavior away from court offered a different portrait. His drunkenness and affairs with women of all social backgrounds, from street prostitutes to society ladies, scandalized the public. Rasputin appeared to bask in his fame, showing off shirts embroidered for him by the Empress and inviting her friends and servants to his home in Perkovsky. Rasputin's wife appeared untroubled by his infidelities, commenting, "He has enough for all." The press, unshackled thanks to the rights granted to them by Nicholas II in 1905, spread lurid tales about Rasputin, both within Russia and abroad. Rumors about Rasputin's influence over the Tsarist regime spread throughout Europe. Petitioners, believing that Rasputin lived with the imperial family, mailed their request to Rasputin, Tsar's Place, St. Petersburg. Soldiers on World War I's Eastern Front spoke of Rasputin's having an intimate affair with Alexandra, passing it off as common knowledge without evidence. As the war progressed, outlandish stories expanded to include Rasputin's supposed treason with the German enemy, including a fantastical tale that he sought to undermine the war effort by starting a cholera epidemic in St. Petersburg with poisoned apples imported from Canada. What the public thought they knew about Rasputin had a greater impact than his actual views and activities, fueling demands that he be removed from his position of influence by any means necessary. That's his dead body, of course. Until he murdered Rasputin, Felix Yusupov lived a comparatively aimless life of privilege. One of Nicholas II's daughters, also named Grand Duchess Olga, worked as a nurse during the war and criticized Yusupov's refusal to enlist, writing to her father, "Felix is a downright civilian, dressed all in brown, virtually doing nothing. An utterly unpleasant impression he makes. A man idling in such times. Wow." Plotting Rasputin's murder gave Yusupov the opportunity to reinvent himself as a patriot and a man of action, determined to protect the throne from a malign influence. For Yusupov and his co-conspirators, the removal of Rasputin could give Nicholas II one last chance of restoring the reputation and prestige of the monarchy. With Rasputin gone, the Tsar would be more open to the advice of his extended family, the nobility, and the Duma, and less dependent on Alexandria. There was hope that he would return from military headquarters and once again govern from St. Petersburg. The most well known account of Rasputin's murder was the one that Yusupov wrote in his memoirs, published in 1928. Yusupov claimed to have invited Rasputin to his palace, to meet his wife Irina, who was in fact away at the time, and then served him a platter of cakes and numerous glasses of wine laced with potassium cyanide. To Yusupov's, and this is where it's weird, to Yusupov's astonishment, Rasputin appeared to be unaffected by the poison. A desperate Yusupov borrowed the revolver of the Grand Duke Dmitri, the Tsar's cousin, and shot Rasputin multiple times, but was still unable to kill him. According to his memoir, this devil who was dying of poison, who had a bullet in his heart, must have been raised from the dead by the powers of evil. There was something appalling and monstrous in his diabolical refusal to die. There was reputedly water in his lungs when his remains were discovered, indicating that he had finally died by drowning. Yusupov's account of Rasputin's murder entered popular culture. The lurid scene was dramatized in the numerous films about Rasputin and the Romanovs, and even made it into a 1970s disco hit by Boney M. Because I'm a nice guy, I'm not going to click on that. They put some poison into his wine. He drank it all and said, I feel fine. Rasputin's actual murder was probably far less dramatic. His daughter Maria, who fled Russia after the revolution and became a circus lion tamer, billed as the daughter of the famous mad monk whose feats in Russia astonished the world, wrote her own book in 1929 that condemned Yusupov's action and questioned the veracity of his account. She wrote that her father did not like sweets and never would have eaten a platter of cakes. The autopsy reports that do not mention poison or drowning, but instead conclude that he was shot in the head at close range. Yusupov transformed the murder into an epic struggle of good versus evil to sell books and bolster his own reputation. The responses from the public were mixed, reflecting Rasputin's checkered reputation. The elite, from whence Yusupov and his co conspirators came, rejoiced and applauded the killers when they appeared in public. The peasantry mourned Rasputin as one of their own, seeing the murder as one more example of the nobility controlling the Tsar. When a peasant rose to a position of influence with the Tsar, he was murdered by wealthy men. To the dismay of Yusupov and his co-conspirators, Rasputin's murder did not lead to a radical change in Nicholas and Alexandra's hearts. Polities. To the emergent Bolsheviks, Rasputin symbolized the corruption at the heart of the imperial court, and his murder was seen, rather accurately, as an attempt by the nobility to hold on to power at the continued expense of the proletariat. To them, Rasputin represented the broader problems with Tsarism. In the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, provisional government leader Alexander Kerensky went so far as to say, without Rasputin, there would have been no Lenin. Guys, this dude was probably pretending to be something he wasn't. And he got such a huge influence in Russia, his affairs with women, his, alleged unwillingness to die. It's just a really interesting story. There's a cool documentary out on him that I urge you guys to check out. But y'all, with that, we'll pause right there, and we're going to pick up tomorrow talking more about Lenin and Stalin. So we're going to stick with Russia, and I will talk to you then. In the meantime, be nice to your siblings. Don't drive your parents crazy.